So today we have the privilege and the honor of having Dr. Maureen Hoyt. Thank you. And she's very special to me, mainly because when I took my oral panels to become a minister, I think it was 21, 22 years ago, I don't even remember, but I know it's in the 20s, like 20. And I didn't pass my first panel, and it wasn't the panel's fault. It was totally my fault. I just kind of freaked out. It's kind of intimidating. And they were good. I shared they were going to let me repanel, and I said no. And then Reverend Bill said, well, if the universe offers you a gift, shouldn't you accept it? And I said yes. So I went to Sandy Jacobs, who was in charge of the panels, and I said, okay, I will repanel. And so I repaneled at Asilomar in the Dolphin Room. And it was Dr. Maxine Kay, those of you who have been here for a while. She was a wonderful assistant minister here for a while. She wasn't then. She shortly, maybe 3 or 4 months after our panel, she came here as the assistant. So she was in there, and Sandy Jacobs, who was in charge of the whole panel thing, and then Dr. Maureen Hoyt. And they paneled me. And I knew, and then you have to leave the room while they discuss you, and then you come back in. But I knew as soon as I walked out that I'd done a great job. And I was just so connected with this group. And then I came back in, and they told me, and I had to tell them, I said, I felt like I was swimming with the dolphins. And so it is my honor, and oh my God, she has been so involved in CSL for so many years, writing curriculum, speaking, just an amazing, amazing minister and doctor. And it's my honor, my privilege to welcome you and to introduce to you Dr. Maureen Hoyt. Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. I forgot about that.
Yeah. I never will.
No, I know. It is intimidating to sit before a panel and know that they're making a decision about the rest of your life. But we were right. We were actually right the first time. We were, you didn't pass the first time, but you passed with flying colors the second time. So there you go. And Dr. Laura is instrumental in inviting me to be here this morning. And I left Newbury Park yesterday at 67 degrees. This is the hottest hot I have been since last summer, I think. Since last summer. So just to be inclusive, I want to wish everybody here a happy Father's Day. Anyone who is a father or had a father. There you go. It includes everybody, right? So what you should know is, let me see if we get this. My dad, 33 years old, holding my sister Donna. She was probably 3 or 4 months old at the time. Handsome guy, huh? Really good looking. Well, my dad is my favorite person in the whole wide world. He's long since passed away, but he's in my heart forever and always. One time I went to Jamaica and I didn't want to come home. I wanted to live there. I love the Jamaican people so much. And my dad said, he said, you can't live there, but you can have the memories. And I think that's what it's all about. My dad lived to be 82 years old. This is him the summer before he passed away. And he was one of the casualties of the HIV issue in the late 80s. He had a transfusion from unfiltered blood, and so he got AIDS. And what's interesting about that is you might think, oh gosh, that's such a tragedy. But what it did for me was I was learning to be a practitioner at that time, and living in Los Angeles, the West Hollywood community center had Louise Hay there every Wednesday night. It was called the Hay Ride. And so I could go there because I was with my dad. I understood AIDS. I understood the way in which people contracted AIDS for the most part. And I could be there in service to people who were there and not have some of the fears that were being passed around having to do with the disease. My dad was one of the smartest men I've ever known. He went to public school, but it was a French immersion school because we were raised in Canada. He lived in Canada at the time. And he went to school till the 8th grade, and then he left and went to a technical school, and he became a steam engineer. He didn't speak much English until he was about 24 years old. But he was a prolific reader, and he would often quote Shakespeare to us. And we didn't realize he was a fledgling religious scientist, right? If I disparaged myself or said something negative, he would say to me, "Maureen, it's the thinking that makes it so. Stop thinking that way." Now, grade 10 English literature, reading Shakespeare, half the time his comments to us came right out of Shakespeare. I mean, right out of Shakespeare. It was funny, but I wanted his sympathy, and when he said, it's the thinking that makes it so, I thought, wait, he's dismissive. He's being dismissive toward me. But I realized that he really was trying to get me to change my thinking. He fully and completely understood the creative process in a way that takes some of us years of going to class to figure out the creative process. A couple of years before he died, I gave him a subscription to Science Mind magazine. And he was thrilled to know that what he'd been thinking and espousing all these years, all his whole life actually, was what my sister Donna and I were studying. And I miss him every day. My sister Donna studied with Dr. Tom Johnson and became a religious science minister. And then when she moved back to Canada, she became a unity minister, which was much more accepted in Canada 30 years ago. So that's just a little bit of history. So here's something interesting. I was last week old when I found out that abracadabra is Aramaic for "I will create as I speak." Now, some of you, all those years ago, of course my dad was right, the Aramaic language wasn't a written language. It was oral. And there was nothing ever transcribed. And there are people like Rocco Errico, some of you who know who he is, who've done great work in translations from Aramaic to English. Science Mind had to decipher certain parts of the Aramaic language in order for them to be fully understand. And there are some huge inconsistencies in the translations. For instance, you've probably heard the saying, "It's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven." Now, how does that even make sense, right? But camel and rope are one letter different in the Aramaic language. So it's easier for it's easier for a rope to get through the eye of a needle than a rich man into heaven. Doesn't that make more sense? Now, if you want to know more about this, you can read Rescuing the Bible from Fundamentalism by Bishop John Shelby Spong, and it'll all fall into place. And I'm not saying throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the Bible, from the teachings of Jesus, are very important to religious science. Ernest Holmes devoted the whole end of the Science of Mind textbook to some translations from the Bible. So I want to tell you a little bit of history here. In 1968, picture this. I feel like what Golden Girls like, right? Picture this, Sophia. I went to hear a speaker at the Scottish Rite Temple at the top of California Street in San Francisco. Everybody should spend at least 10 years living in San Francisco when they're in their 20s, right? Best place ever. And it's not to say that I was dragged there kicking and screaming, but it's close enough to the truth. I really didn't want to go. But most of the time, when we figure out we don't want to do something, that's usually the time when we really have to do that thing. It's something moving us forward, something propelling us forward. I cried through the whole talk. The place was packed, and you could hear a pin drop. The speaker was Neville Goddard. And he wrote a book called Creative Imagination, which is probably one of my all-time favorite books of his. I told my friend that if there were a church teaching this idea of creative imagination, I'd be there in a heartbeat. His clipped British accent had me a believer after probably the first 5 minutes. Fast forward to 1974, and again, picture this. I was at Unity of Pasadena, not to go to church, but to go to a Weight Watcher meeting. It didn't work, by the way. Anyway, the lecturer was amazing. She never talked recipes or food issues. She would say things like, change your thinking, change your life. She would talk for probably an hour about how if we only use our creative imagination to a better, a greater, a more consistent degree, our lives would all outpicture in exactly the way we want them to outpicture. She sounded just like Neville Goddard. One day after everyone left, I decided to stay behind and have a chat with her. I wanted to find out where she learned all this positive, life-affirming conversation that she had. She asked me, "Are you churched?" Churched? I'd never heard a turn of phrase like that before. I told her I was a lapsed Catholic. And she beamed and said, "So am I. Would you like to come to church with me on Sunday? You'll hear a lot more about what I say on Saturdays." I agreed to meet her at South Pasadena. My husband made me drive my own car because he thought religious science sounded like a cult. And he wanted to make sure that they weren't going to capture me and keep me prisoner or whatever. He has a vivid imagination. Suffice it to say that I went that Sunday to Founders Church of Religious Science at 6th and Brando. I heard Dr. William Hornaday, having no expectations. The added bonus that Sunday was Dr. McNeil and the 150-person choir that was there. And when Beethoven said, "Music is the great mediator between the spiritual and the sensual," you got it this morning in spades from your group here today. And listening to that choir with Dr. McNeil at the helm, I was in rapture. Okay, if I died right then, I would be okay. Well, the Buddhists say, expect nothing. Be prepared for everything. Expect nothing. Little did I know in 1968, when I said I would go to a church that taught what Neville was saying, I set a law in motion through the auspices of the creative process and my creative imagination to demonstrate Deanna, who took me to the church. I left my car at her house, by the way. The Weight Watcher lecturer that I had on Saturdays, her invitation to Founders, and getting to meet Dr. Hornaday in person. When he shook my hand, I felt like I touched a hand of God. And like Dr. Tom Costa, the next Sunday when I went back, he called me by name. Tom Costa used to do this, and I thought, when I become a minister, I'm going to do that too. I'm going to figure out, there's nothing, as my dad used to say, there's nothing as sweet as a person's own name. That's part of Shakespeare, too. There's my dad again. Even though there's a typo in this meme, being that I've rewired myself as an editor proofreader, I wanted to share it with you because of its significance in the creative process and the use of our imagination. It goes, true surrender is not a one-time event. It is a process, the gradual letting go of the small self to the big self in each moment. Big self meaning devoid of the ego, for sure. True surrender is the daily dying of our desires, our wants, expectations, grievances, and our attachments. True surrender requires an opening of the heart to the unknown. The typo is in the last word. True surrender requires an opening of the heart to the unknown. You know, we don't have to know how the creative process works. We don't have to know how creative imagination works, because that's up to God. We know the what, we know maybe the when, and certainly we know the why, because the why is heart connected. That Saturday when I said I would go to a church like this if there was one, I set a law in motion, through conscious mind, and forgot about it. Let it go, released it. Deanna asked me to go to church with her, and I said yes, because all those Saturdays that she lectured to us, something in me was being stirred. Something was filled to overflowing. Something was being born in me, if you will. I could not have articulated this then, but I know unequivocally that that's what happened. The creative process requires an idea or a seed thought. That's the masculine principle, or the conscious mind, or the father, as it says in the creative process diagram. The seed thought gets planted in the subconscious mind, or the feminine principle, or the mother, and shows up as an invitation to Founders Church. A simpler story here might be appropriate. When my kids were in high school, I drove a Toyota Previa. I told my friend Gilmore yesterday, I've had 9 Toyotas in my life. I started out with a Toyota Corona in the 60s, and I now have a RAV4. Best car ever. Anyway, I drove a Toyota Previa because I was hauling kids to teen camp in those days, and I was hauling my son's football team around. You know, football players have a certain aroma about them. Anyway, in addition to that, Monday morning I get in my car, and my kid's dad has hauled manure in my car, didn't bother to clean it afterwards, and I'm about to visit with my friend Margaret for lunch, and I'm driving her. Margaret, we used to call her Mrs. McNeatley, and I am chagrined and dismayed at the smell in my car. I drove to work with all the windows open. It didn't really help. And so I'm a receptionist for a financial planner. I sit at the front desk, and I sat there and I had to do kind of a little treatment around this. Okay, Margaret's coming to see me. She doesn't care about my car. The smell will go away by the time lunch comes around. All this kind of stuff. I surrendered completely, as it said in that last meme, right? Maybe 30 seconds later, the front door of the office opens. A guy sticks his head in the door and says, "I'm a detail guy. Anybody here want their car washed?" True story. You can't make stuff like this up, right? 30 seconds. That was all, because I surrendered completely. So the Buddhists say, here's the creative process diagram. You really can't see it, so forget about it. Okay, I got to take this one back for a second. Anyway, Ernest Holmes' version of the Buddhist proverb is always expect the best. You know, same thing, sort of different day. But to me, we are intended to have a superlative life experience. That means the best. Any word that you can put EST on the end means the best, right? Except when people use epitome. Epitome is the ultimate. You can't have the best epitome, because that's redundant, right? Okay, never mind. That's your grammar lesson for the morning. You know, Ernest knew that we could have our best life now. And that the creative process, when it's used intelligently and constructively, along with the creative imagination that everybody has, it results in a life that's worth living, a wonderful life. In November, you know, when we plant tulip bulbs or daffodil bulbs in our yard, do we keep digging them up to see if they're growing? No, we don't. We leave them in the soil, letting them do their tulip and daffodil thing, right? So knowing the creative process doesn't need us to know how the tulips know when to bloom in February or March or whenever. Like this year, they were late, April. May, some of them were blooming. Because it's how is up to God. How is up to God. If you look closely at this creative process here, on the top level, you can't really see it, but on the top level is conscious mind, in the middle is subconscious mind. These are not two minds, they're two aspects of the same mind. You can't have one without the other, like love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage, you know. You can't have conscious mind and without subconscious mind. So it's the bottom section is the effect. And this is when something in form shows up in our lives, it's because it required imagination. It required imagination. That song was perfect that she sang this morning. What if it doesn't happen as our errant thinking that shows up? You know, what if? What if is only for people who write spy novels. It's not for religious scientists to say, what if? Anyway, what if God doesn't want me to have the thing or do the thing that I think I want? The God of my understanding always says yes. Always says yes. No matter how stupid my idea is sometimes. I am the one who gets in the way of my own demonstration. Okay, so now we have this cute little girl. Now, if I were really mean, I'd ask us all to stand up and see if we could do this. But I won't. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Her head's on the ground. It's not just touching her feet, her head's on the ground. But it's true. Sometimes we need to look at things from a different perspective. I defy any one of us to embrace this position. But we don't need to do this to see life from a different perspective. So the question comes up, how would it be if life got easier? How would it be if life got easier? One of my teachers is Dr. Maria Nemeth, who wrote a book called Mastering Life's Energies. I went through her coaching academy to learn how to be a spiritual coach in a way that was productive and in a way that worked for people. When I finally finished the coursework, I needed to go back and make amends to so many people that I'd screwed up by my counseling and coaching prior to this time. But her book, Mastering Life's Energies, is a definitive work on how to cope in a world that appears to be in chaos. Appears to be, is what I say. That's very religious scientist when we say that. She says it's not the world out there that's in chaos. It's the world in us that's in chaos. Is it the microcosm, the macrocosm, or the microcosm? Is it what we are seeing or what we believe about what we're seeing that's going on out there? And when we can figure out how to kind of separate the two, we will be able to see the world rightly. The simplicity of the creative process or our creative imagination is finding something more interesting to think about. When we are down and out, feeling sad or depressed, or experiencing a certain undefined malaise, which is going on for a lot of people right now, we are focusing on what's wrong and not what's working. Find something more interesting to think about. What's on your mind become what's in your life. So think the thoughts you want to see. That's the Gandhi translation. Narrowed arteries cut off blood flow to the brain. A narrowed mind cuts off love flow to the heart. Whew. There's a few narrowed minds out there right now. And if we buy into what those people are saying and thinking and doing, then we have to go back and sit in that chair and do that prayer work and that meditation that brings us back to center. Because it may be true about what's going on, but it's not the truth of what's going on. When our mind is narrowed, we're cut off by what matters in life. We begin to withhold. We withhold affection. We withhold truth. We withhold our generosity. We withhold our time, withhold our money, and we wonder why we feel so constricted. Oh my goodness, can you imagine having your arms perpetually wrapped around yourself? You can't move. Creative imagination only comes from an open heart or an expanded heart. Change does not occur from complacence or contentment. It only comes through irritation. Just think of the oyster. That little bit of sand in the oyster creates a beautiful pearl. When someone comes to me with fear of financial insecurity, I always ask them where they're withholding. The creative process cannot function properly in our lives when we're in the doldrums. The imagination needs breadth and width and depth to be used effectively. Today, we would do well to make an agreement with ourselves to realize that we are infinite beings having a spiritual life in human form. We are only limited by the extent of our imagination. And if we argue for our limitations, here's where you need your silver bullet that they handed out at the beginning. We get to keep them. When we argue for our limitations, we get to keep them. So, the God of my understanding created me with free will and choice, knowing always that God's will for me and my will for me are one and the same thing. In closing today, I'm showing you something I just made up a couple of days ago. Desire plus decision equals demonstration. You know, Raymond Charles Barker wrote a book called The Power of Decision. But the interesting thing about that book, The Power of Decision doesn't mean anything unless you act on it. The old joke about 5 frogs sitting on a log, one decides to jump off. How many frogs are on the log? 5. Deciding doesn't do anything. You have to take the action. I know it's a trick question. Forgive me. So this is the creative process and the creative imagination in a nutshell. We all have the power to demonstrate our fondest desires to as great as we can conceive. John Muir said, "The power of imagination makes us infinite." In fact, I want you to understand something. If you turn and look at your neighbor, everyone here is as a result of the creative process. Everyone here is a result of creative imagination. You're all uniquely, wonderfully individualized people. None of you look the same. And isn't that wonderful? Wouldn't it be boring if everybody looked alike? You couldn't tell people apart. But you would, though, because we would have to get to the vibration level to be able to know who people are. And that could make a big difference in life. So that God so loved itself that it needed form to express, that's why you're here. God, in its infinite wisdom, with the assistance of your mom and dad or however you showed up in this world by immaculate conception, I have no idea. That's the Catholic in me showing up. You know, here we are, all of us, expressing the creative process and creative imagination so beautifully. Now, in closing, I just want to remind you what Emma Curtis Hopkins used to say, and it was always in capital letters in her books. Now go out there and act like it, knowing that with God, all things are possible. And so it is. Yay!